The door opened silently. A man stood frozen in the doorway of his daughter's playroom. His breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. He'd come home early from a board meeting. Cancelled everything. Something his assistant said he'd never done in 20 years. But today was different. Today, he'd received a text from his head of staff that simply read, "You need to see this." Now, standing in that doorway, he understood why. Inside the playroom, his twin daughters sat on the floor. But they weren't sitting the way they'd been sitting for the past 9 months. Not with that hollow, empty stare. Not with that terrible stillness that made them look like porcelain dolls instead of 9-year-old children. They were leaning forward, eyes focused, lips slightly parted. And in front of them, on her knees on the carpet, was the woman they'd hired 3 months ago. The maid who'd come with no special credentials, no therapy training, no letters after her name, just a recommendation from an agency that said she was patient with difficult children. But what he saw her doing in that moment made absolutely no sense. She wasn't reading to them. She wasn't showing them toys or games. She wasn't doing any of the things the 6 therapists before her had tried. She was doing something so simple, so strange, so utterly ordinary that he almost laughed. Except he couldn't laugh. Because for the first time in 9 months, since the day their mother died, his daughters' faces showed something other than grief. They showed curiosity. The woman was holding a simple glass of water, and she was teaching them something he had never seen before, something that would change everything. But before he could step into the room, before he could ask what was happening, one of his daughters did something that made his knees weak. She smiled. Not a forced smile, not a polite smile, a real smile. And then the other twin laughed. Actually laughed. The sound hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, because he'd thought he would never hear that sound again. He'd thought his daughters were broken beyond repair, that grief had taken them somewhere he couldn't reach, that he'd spend the rest of his life looking at the shells of his children, remembering who they used to be. But here they were, leaning forward, engaged, present. And it was all because of something this woman was doing with a simple glass of water. What was it? What could possibly be so powerful that it could reach children who'd been unreachable for 9 months? He stayed in that doorway, hidden, watching, afraid that if he moved, if he breathed too loudly, the moment would shatter, and he'd lose them all over again. Before we dive into what this maid was doing and how it saved this family, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this that remind us what truly matters in life. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to know what came before it. The man standing in that doorway was Richard Caldwell, a self-made billionaire whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and philanthropic reports. Richard wasn't just wealthy. He was billionaire wealthy, the kind of wealth that appeared in Forbes lists and business magazines. Self-made. Started with nothing. Built a commercial real estate empire that spanned 43 states. He had homes most people would never see. Jets, cars, art collections. Everything money could buy, including, he'd thought, the ability to fix any problem that arose. But 9 months ago, Richard learned the hardest lesson of his life. Some problems can't be fixed with money. His wife, Margaret, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Stage 4. Already metastasized. They caught it too late. Richard had immediately mobilized every resource available. The best oncologists in the world. Experimental treatments. Specialists flown in from Germany, Japan, Switzerland. He'd spent millions in a matter of weeks. But cancer didn't care about his bank account. 6 weeks after diagnosis, Margaret was gone. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, with Richard holding one hand and both daughters holding the other. Her last words were to the girls. Be brave, love each other, and remember that I'll always be with you. Then she closed her eyes, and she never opened them again. Richard had prepared himself for grief, for the logistics of death, for funeral arrangements and legal matters. What he hadn't prepared for was what happened to his daughters. Eleanor and Sophie, his twin girls, had been inseparable from their mother. Margaret had been a hands-on parent despite Richard's wealth. She'd homeschooled the girls until 3rd grade, cooked with them, gardened with them, read to them every single night. She was the center of their world. And when she died, that center collapsed. The girls didn't cry at the funeral. They stood beside the casket, holding hands, their faces blank. People commented on how well they were handling it, how mature they seemed. Richard knew better. They weren't handling it well. They were shutting down. In the days and weeks after Margaret's death, the twins became increasingly withdrawn. They stopped talking except when directly asked a question. They'd answer in 1 or 2 words, their voices flat and emotionless. They stopped eating unless food was placed directly in front of them. They'd pick at meals, eating just enough to avoid being forced. They stopped playing. The playroom that had once been full of laughter and imagination sat silent. Toys remained untouched. Art supplies gathered dust. The girls would sit in their shared bedroom for hours, staring at nothing. Richard tried everything. He took time off work, something he'd never done. He sat with them, trying to engage them in conversation, asking about their feelings, trying to get them to open up. But they'd just stare at him with those hollow eyes and give one-word answers. Fine. Okay. Nothing. He brought in the first therapist 2 weeks after Margaret's death. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a child psychologist who specialized in grief counseling. She came highly recommended, had written books on childhood bereavement. She met with the girls 3 times a week for a month, and accomplished nothing. The girls would sit in her office, answer her questions with minimal responses, and never engage. Dr. Morrison told Richard they needed more time, that grief was a process, that he shouldn't push. But Richard could see his daughters disappearing. He brought in a 2nd therapist, then a 3rd, then specialists in childhood trauma, art therapists who tried to get them to express feelings through drawing, play therapists who tried to reach them through games. Nothing worked. The girls remained locked inside themselves, unreachable. By month 4, Richard was desperate. He'd spent over $200,000 on specialists. He'd consulted with experts from 3 different countries. He'd tried every evidence-based approach to childhood grief. And his daughters were getting worse, not better. They'd lost weight. Their eyes had dark circles underneath them. They moved through the house like ghosts, present but not really there. The mansion that had once been full of life became a mausoleum. Richard's staff whispered in corners, worried looks on their faces. Everyone could see the girls were fading, but no one knew how to stop it. Richard would lie awake at night in the master bedroom. He could no longer stand to sleep in, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it. If his daughters would spend the rest of their lives locked in grief. If he'd already lost them even though they were still breathing. He thought about Margaret constantly, about how she would have known what to do. She'd always been the emotional center of the family, the one who understood what people needed before they knew themselves. Richard was good at business, at strategy and negotiation and building empires. But feelings? Emotions? Those had always been Margaret's territory. And now she was gone. And he was failing their daughters. Failing spectacularly. Month 5 brought a new low. Sophie stopped speaking entirely. Not one word for 3 straight days. Richard rushed her to the hospital, terrified something was physically wrong. The doctors found nothing. Selective mutism, they said. Common in traumatized children. They prescribed medication. Richard filled the prescription but couldn't bring himself to give it to her. She was 9 years old, and they wanted to put her on antidepressants. Everything in him rebelled against it. But what choice did he have? That night, sitting in his study with the pill bottle in his hand, Richard broke down completely. He sobbed the way he hadn't sobbed since Margaret's funeral. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. He'd built a billion-dollar empire. He could negotiate deals that moved markets. He could solve problems that others thought were impossible. But he couldn't save his own daughters. His head of household staff, a woman named Claudia who'd been with the family for 8 years, found him there. She didn't say anything, just sat with him while he cried. When he finally calmed down, she spoke quietly. "Mr. Caldwell, I have an idea. But you're not going to like it. Richard looked up at her with red, swollen eyes. At this point, I'll try anything. Claudia hesitated. What if we stopped trying to fix them? Richard stared at her. What? Every therapist, every specialist, they all come in trying to make the girls better. Trying to get them to process their grief in specific ways. Trying to move them through stages. Claudia leaned forward. But what if they don't need fixing? What if they just need presence? Consistency? Someone who shows up every day and doesn't demand anything from them. Richard shook his head. We've tried that. I've tried being present. It doesn't work. With respect, sir, you haven't. You've been present while also trying to get them to heal. You're still pushing even when you don't realize it. Every interaction has an agenda. Claudia pulled out her phone. I have a friend who works at a domestic staffing agency. She told me about a woman who worked with a family in a similar situation. 3 children who'd lost their father suddenly. They were all traumatized, withdrawn. And this woman helped them? Not exactly. She just stayed. Showed up every day. Didn't try to be their therapist or their mother. Just existed in their space until they were ready to exist back. Richard wanted to dismiss it. It sounded too simple, too passive. But then he looked at the pill bottle in his hand and thought about his 9-year-old daughter who'd stopped speaking. What's her name? Elena Morales. She's 32. Widow. No children of her own. She's worked in various households, mostly with families going through difficult transitions. Does she have credentials? Training in psychology or grief counseling? Claudia shook her head. No formal training. But the families she's worked with, they all say the same thing. That she has a gift for reaching people who can't be reached. It sounded like magical thinking. Like desperation masked as wisdom. But Richard was desperate. Set up an interview. Elena Morales arrived 3 days later. She drove herself in an old sedan. Wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater. Carried no briefcase, no portfolio of references. Richard met her in his study, prepared to conduct a normal interview. To assess her qualifications and determine if she was a good fit. But Elena didn't present herself the way other candidates had. She didn't talk about her experience or her methods. Instead, she asked Richard to tell her about Margaret. No one had asked him that. Everyone avoided mentioning Margaret, as if her name was taboo. But Elena sat across from him, patient and calm, and waited. So Richard talked. He told her everything. How he'd met Margaret at a charity event 20 years ago. How she'd called him out for caring more about networking than the actual cause. How that honesty had intrigued him. How their first date had been at a coffee shop, not some expensive restaurant, because Margaret didn't care about his money. He told her about their wedding. About the day the twins were born. About Margaret's laugh and her terrible singing voice and the way she left notes around the house for him and the girls to find. By the time he finished, he'd been talking for over an hour. Elena had barely spoken. She'd just listened. Then she asked one question. What would Margaret want for those girls right now? Richard thought about it. Really thought about it. She'd want them to feel safe enough to grieve. To not have to pretend they're okay. To know they can fall apart and someone will still be there. Elena nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. Richard hired her that afternoon. Elena started the following Monday. She arrived at 7 in the morning, just as Claudia had instructed. Richard watched on the security cameras from his office, curious about what this woman would do. Elena didn't go directly to the girls. Instead, she started in the kitchen. She made breakfast. Simple things. Oatmeal with honey. Fresh fruit cut into small pieces. Toast with butter. She set 2 plates at the kitchen island, poured 2 glasses of orange juice, and then she waited. She didn't call the girls down. Didn't send anyone to get them. Just waited. After 20 minutes, she began her other tasks. Cleaning the kitchen. Organizing the pantry. All while humming softly. No particular song. Just a low, melodic sound. The girls didn't come down that morning. Elena didn't seem bothered. She wrapped the food, put it in the refrigerator and moved to other parts of the house. Richard watched, frustrated. This was what he was paying for? Someone to hum and clean? But he'd promised Claudia he'd give it time. The second day was the same. Elena arrived, made breakfast, waited, hummed while she cleaned. The girls stayed upstairs. Third day, same thing. Richard was ready to fire her. This was absurd. But on the fourth day, something changed. Richard was watching the camera feed when he saw Sophie appear at the top of the stairs. She didn't come down. She just stood there, one hand on the banister, watching Elena in the kitchen below. Elena had her back turned. She was humming that same wordless melody while wiping down the counters. Sophie stood there for 5 minutes. Then she turned and went back upstairs. Elena never acknowledged her, never turned around, never made any indication she'd known Sophie was there. But Richard saw the smallest smile cross Elena's face as she continued working. Fifth day, Sophie came to the top of the stairs again. This time she stayed for 10 minutes. Elena continued her routine, seemingly unaware. Sixth day, Sophie descended 3 steps. Elena kept humming. By the end of the second week, Sophie was making it all the way to the kitchen. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, would just sit at the island, staring at the untouched plate in front of her. Elena would work around her, humming, going about her tasks, never pushing, never asking questions, just present. Eleanor took longer. She was more suspicious, more guarded. But by week 3, she was coming downstairs too, sitting next to Sophie. Both girls silent, both untouching their food, but present. Richard watched all of this, baffled. Nothing was happening. The girls weren't talking, weren't eating, weren't engaging. How was this better than what the therapists had tried? But Claudia told him to be patient. Watch how the girls look at her, Claudia said. They're not afraid. They're not performing. They're just there. Week 4 brought the first real change. Sophie, who still hadn't spoken since her 3-day mutism a month earlier, made a sound. Not a word, just a small hum, matching Elena's melody. Elena didn't react, didn't make a big deal of it, just kept humming. And Sophie hummed with her, for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Richard, watching from his office, felt tears on his face. It was the first sound his daughter had made in weeks. The next day, Sophie hummed again. Longer this time. Eleanor watched her sister, something flickering in her eyes. Not quite interest, but not quite the empty blankness either. By week 5, both girls were humming along with Elena while they sat at the kitchen island. Still not eating much, still not talking, but making sounds, being present in a way they hadn't been since Margaret died. Richard wanted to rush the process, wanted to push them to talk, to eat more, to engage more. But Elena counseled patience. They're finding their way back, she said. We can't drag them. They have to walk it themselves. Week 6 was when Richard saw it. The thing that would change everything. He'd come home early from a meeting, something he'd been doing more frequently. Claudia's text had said, "You need to see this." Richard had hurried home, fear tight in his chest. Was something wrong? Had the girls regressed? But when he arrived and Claudia pointed him toward the playroom, he didn't hear crying. He heard nothing, which was somehow more unsettling. He approached quietly and looked through the doorway. And that's when he saw it. Elena was kneeling on the floor. The twins sat across from her, maybe 3 feet away. And Elena was holding a simple glass of water. She placed it on the carpet between them. Then she did something strange. She put her finger in the water, pulled it out, and held it up so a single drop trembled at her fingertip. The girls leaned forward, watching. Elena moved her finger slowly, and the drop of water moved with it, defying gravity for a moment before falling. Sophie's eyes widened. Eleanor's mouth opened slightly. Elena smiled. She dipped her finger again. This time she brought the drop close to Sophie's hand. "Want to try?" Elena asked softly. It was the first time Richard had heard her directly address the girls with a question. Sophie hesitated. Then slowly, so slowly, she extended her hand. Elena let the drop fall onto Sophie's palm. Sophie stared at it. Then, miracle of miracles, she smiled. Not a big smile. just the corners of her mouth turning up. But it was there. Real. Present. Eleanor was watching intently now. Elena dipped her finger again and offered a drop to Eleanor. Eleanor looked at it suspiciously. Then she extended her hand. The drop fell, and Eleanor laughed. Actually laughed. A short, surprised sound. But laughter. Richard gripped the doorframe, his legs suddenly weak. Elena continued the exercise, taking drops of water and placing them on the girl's hands, their arms, watching as the drops rolled and fell. Such a simple thing. Water, gravity, physics. But somehow, this simple act was reaching his daughters when nothing else had. "It's like magic," Sophie whispered, her first words in weeks. "It's not magic," Elena said gently. "It's just science. Water has surface tension. It sticks together. But gravity is stronger, so eventually it falls. But for a moment, you can make it do amazing things." She demonstrated again, this time making a drop hover on her fingertip for a long moment before letting it fall. "Can we try?" Eleanor asked. Richard's breath caught. Eleanor had asked a question. An actual question. With curiosity in her voice. Elena handed Eleanor the glass. "Be very gentle. Just the tip of your finger." Eleanor dipped her finger in the water. Pulled it out. Stared at the drop clinging to her skin. Then she moved her finger and watched the drop shift and wobble. "It's alive," she breathed. "It looks alive," Elena agreed. "But it's just following the laws of physics. Still, it's beautiful, isn't it?" "Yeah," Sophie said. "It is." For the next 20 minutes, Richard watched his daughters play with water drops, experimenting, laughing when drops fell in unexpected ways, concentrating when trying to make drops hover, actually engaged with something, actually present, actually being children again. Elena supervised but didn't direct. She let them explore, let them discover, let them be. When the water glass was finally empty and the carpet was dotted with wet spots, Elena stood. "Tomorrow we can try something else. There are lots of amazing things in the world if you know how to look at them." "Like what?" Sophie asked eagerly. Elena pretended to think. "Well, have you ever really looked at a spider web? Or watched ice melt? Or seen how light makes rainbows in bubbles?" Both girls shook their heads. "Then we have lots to discover," Elena said. She left the playroom, walking past Richard without acknowledging him. But he saw the look in her eyes. Triumph. Not the showy kind, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just accomplished something significant. Richard stood in that doorway long after Elena left. His daughters were still on the floor, talking to each other in low voices. Actually talking, having a conversation, for the first time in 6 months. About water drops and surface tension and what they might explore tomorrow. And Richard finally understood what Elena was doing. She wasn't trying to fix his daughters. She wasn't trying to make them process their grief or talk about their feelings. She was reminding them that the world was still full of wonder. That there were still things worth being curious about. That life, even after devastating loss, still held moments of beauty and discovery. She was teaching them to see again. Not to forget their mother, not to move on from their grief, but to remember that grief didn't have to be the only thing they felt, that they could miss their mother and still find joy in a water drop, that sadness and curiosity could exist in the same moment, that being broken didn't mean being dead. Richard went to find Elena. She was in the kitchen, cleaning up from breakfast. He stood in the doorway, not sure what to say. Finally, he managed, "How did you know?" Elena looked up. "Know what?" That water drops would reach them. That showing them something simple and beautiful would work when nothing else did. Elena dried her hands on a towel. "I didn't know. I just remembered something my grandmother used to do when I was sad. She'd show me small wonders. Dewdrops on spider webs. The way ants carried things 10 times their size. The pattern of veins in leaves." Elena's voice was soft. She'd say, "Elena, the world is full of magic if you pay attention. And when you're sad, sometimes the only thing that helps is remembering there's still magic." Richard felt his throat tighten. My daughters haven't been paying attention to anything for 6 months. I know. They were too deep in their pain. But pain is exhausting. Eventually, you need a break from it, even if just for a few minutes. Elena met his eyes. The water drops gave them permission to take that break. To be curious instead of sad. To be present instead of drowning. Will it last? Richard asked. Or will they go back to how they were? I don't know, Elena admitted. Grief isn't linear. They'll have good days and bad days. But now they know they can have good moments. That grief doesn't have to be constant. That's important. Richard nodded slowly. Over the following weeks, Elena continued her work. Each day she introduced something new. Small wonders that required attention and presence. She taught the girls how to make crystals from sugar water. How to create miniature tornadoes in bottles. How light bent through a prism into rainbows. She showed them how plants grew from seeds. How caterpillars transformed into butterflies. How the moon changed shape throughout the month. Every lesson was simple, based on observation and curiosity. Nothing therapeutic or heavy. Just look at this amazing thing the world does. And slowly, day by day, the girls came back to life. They started eating more, started sleeping better, started talking not just to Elena but to each other and to Richard. They still had hard days. Days when grief overwhelmed them and they couldn't get out of bed. Days when they cried for their mother until they couldn't breathe. But those days became less frequent. And between them were moments of genuine joy, genuine curiosity, genuine presence. Richard watched this transformation with awe. He'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on experts, and none of them had reached his daughters. But Elena, with her simple demonstrations of natural wonders, had found a way in. She'd reminded them that the world was bigger than their grief, that there were still things worth paying attention to, that life could still surprise and delight them if they let it. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story of how one woman's simple wisdom saved a broken family. 3 months after Elena started, Richard made a decision. He needed to understand her method more deeply, not just observe it from cameras or doorways, but actually participate. One morning, he came downstairs early and found Elena in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "Can I help?" he asked. Elena looked surprised but nodded. "You can cut the fruit." They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Richard spoke. "I need to understand what you're doing, how you're reaching them." Elena continued stirring oatmeal. "I'm not doing anything special." "But you are," Richard insisted. "Every therapist failed. Every expert with fancy degrees and published research couldn't reach them. But you did. With water drops and science experiments. Why does that work?" Elena turned off the stove and faced him. "Because it's not about them. It's about the world." Richard frowned. "I don't understand." Every therapist who came here focused on the girls, on their feelings, on processing their trauma, on making them talk about their mother. Elena leaned against the counter. "But grief is self-focused by nature. It's all internal, all about what you've lost and how much it hurts. And when you're drowning in that internal world, having someone push you deeper doesn't help." "So you pulled them out?" Richard asked. "No, I gave them a ladder, something external to focus on, something that existed independent of their grief." Elena gestured toward the window, where morning light was streaming in. "Water drops don't care that their mother died. Spider webs don't know about their pain. Rainbows happen whether you're sad or happy. These things exist in the world, doing their beautiful, amazing things, regardless of human suffering." She met Richard's eyes. And there's something deeply comforting about that, about being reminded that the world is bigger than your pain, that life continues, that there's still wonder to be found if you look for it. Richard absorbed this. "So you were teaching them to look outward instead of inward." "I was teaching them they could do both. That they could hold their grief and still notice beauty. That missing their mother and being amazed by a butterfly weren't mutually exclusive." Richard thought about this. about how every therapeutic intervention had focused on the girl's internal experience, on validating their feelings and processing their trauma. Important things, but perhaps not the only things. Elena had given them something else. Permission to experience joy without guilt. To be curious without betraying their mother's memory. To engage with the world that continued spinning despite their loss. "I want to learn," Richard said. "Teach me what you're teaching them." Elena smiled. "It's not complicated. You just have to pay attention. Really pay attention to the small things that most people ignore." Over the next few weeks, Richard joined Elena's daily lessons with the girls. At first, he felt awkward. He was a businessman, not a teacher. He dealt with abstractions, money, deals, strategy. Not water drops and spider webs. But Elena was patient with him, the way she was patient with his daughters. She taught him to slow down, to notice, to wonder. One afternoon, she took all three of them into the garden. "Look at this rose," she said, pointing to one of the bushes Margaret had planted years ago. Richard looked at it. A red rose. Pretty. Nothing special. "What do you see?" Elena asked. "A flower," Richard said. Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Dad, actually look." So Richard looked. Really looked. He noticed the layers of petals, each one slightly different in shade. The way water droplets from the morning watering clung to the edges. The small bee crawling inside, covered in yellow pollen. The way the stem curved slightly, as if bowing under the weight of the bloom. "There's a whole world in this one flower," Elena said softly. "The bee is getting food while helping the plant reproduce. The water droplets are reflecting light in tiny rainbows if you look at the right angle. The petals will fall in a few days, but right now, in this moment, it's perfect." Sophie leaned in close. "Mom planted this one." Elena nodded. "She did. And every time it blooms, it's like she left you a gift. A reminder that life keeps growing. That beauty keeps happening." Eleanor touched one of the petals gently. "I like that it's from Mom but also new. Like she's still here but also not." "Exactly," Elena said. "Everything is like that. Old and new at the same time. Past and present existing together." Richard felt something shift in his chest. This rose wasn't making him forget Margaret. It was helping him remember her in a way that didn't hurt quite so much. That connected her to the present instead of trapping her in the past. That night, after the girls went to bed, Richard found himself standing in the garden alone, looking at the roses in the moonlight, noticing how the shadows played across the petals, how the night air carried their scent, how even in darkness there was beauty if you paid attention. For the first time since Margaret's death, Richard felt something other than grief or numbness. He felt peace, not happiness, not joy, but a quiet acceptance that life continued, that the world still held wonder, that grief and beauty could coexist. Over the following months, Elena's influence spread beyond just the morning lessons. She taught Richard and the girls to find wonder in everyday moments. The pattern of frost on windows in winter. The way cooking bacon filled the house with smell and sound. How shadows changed throughout the day. The way rain created patterns on the windows. She taught them to be present, not to fix things or achieve goals, but simply to notice and appreciate. It was the opposite of everything Richard had built his career on. Business was about looking ahead, planning, strategizing, optimizing. Never about stopping to notice a frost pattern or watch shadows move. But he found that this attention to small wonders had an unexpected effect. It made him calmer, less reactive, more grounded. He started applying it to his work, actually listening in meetings instead of planning his next comment, noticing body language and unspoken concerns, being present with his employees and partners instead of always thinking 3 steps ahead. His business partners commented on the change. "You seem different," one said. "More settled." Richard didn't know how to explain it. That he'd learned to notice water drops from a maid. That paying attention to small wonders had somehow made him better at everything else. But it had. 6 months after Elena started, Richard threw a small dinner party. Just a few close friends and family members who'd been supportive during the darkest time. His sister Catherine came. Margaret's parents flew in from Florida. A few of Richard's longtime business associates who'd become friends. Elena was invited too, though she initially tried to decline. "I'm staff," she said. "It wouldn't be appropriate." "Your family," Richard corrected. "And this dinner is partially to thank you." Elena came, and Richard watched as his daughters showed the guests what they'd learned. Eleanor demonstrated how to create a rainbow with a glass of water and a flashlight. Sophie explained the life cycle of butterflies using specimens they'd collected and preserved. Both girls were animated, engaged, enthusiastic about their subjects. Catherine pulled Richard aside during the evening. "They're different," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I mean, I can still see the sadness. But they're alive again." "Elena did that," Richard said. "Elena helped," Catherine corrected. "But you let her. A lot of people in your position would have fired her after a week when nothing seemed to be happening." Richard thought about that. She was right. He'd been tempted to fire Elena many times in those early weeks, when nothing seemed to be changing, when the girls were still silent and withdrawn. But something had made him hold on. Maybe desperation, maybe intuition, maybe just exhaustion from trying everything else. Whatever it was, it had saved his family. That night, after everyone left and the girls were in bed, Richard found Elena cleaning up in the kitchen. "You don't have to do that," he said. "We have staff." "I know, but I like it. Helps me think." Richard grabbed a dish towel and started drying. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Richard spoke. "I want to offer you something more permanent. Not just as staff. As, I don't know what to call it. Family educator? Life coach? Those terms don't seem right." Elena smiled slightly. "How about just Elena?" Richard laughed. "Fair enough. But I'm serious. What you've done for my daughters, for me, it's priceless. I want to make sure you're taken care of. Better salary, benefits, whatever you need." Elena set down the plate she was washing. "Richard, I appreciate that. But I need to tell you something." Richard felt his stomach drop. "You're leaving." "No, not leaving. But we need to talk about what comes next." Elena dried her hands and turned to face him. "The girls are doing so much better. But they don't need me the way they did 6 months ago. And that's good. That's the goal. But it means my role needs to change." Richard felt panic rising. "Change how?" "I need to step back a bit. Let you take over more of what I've been doing. The girls need to rebuild their connection with you, not become dependent on me." Richard shook his head. "But what if they regress? What if they need you and you're not there?" Elena's expression was compassionate. "Then they'll learn they can handle it." "Richard, I'm not their mother. I'm not a replacement for Margaret. I'm a bridge, something to help them cross from grief back to life. But they can't stay on the bridge forever. They need to reach the other side." "And you think they're ready for that?" "I think they're getting there. And I think you're ready to help them the rest of the way." Richard wanted to argue, to insist that Elena was essential, that the family would fall apart without her. But deep down he knew she was right. The girls were stronger now. He was stronger now. They'd learned Elena's lessons. How to find wonder in small things. How to be present. How to hold grief and joy simultaneously. They could carry those lessons forward without her constant presence. "So what does stepping back look like?" he asked. "I'll still be here. But maybe 3 days a week instead of 6. Maybe you handle the morning routines I've been doing. Maybe you take them on the wonder walks and nature observations." Elena smiled. "You've been watching and learning. You know how to do this now. You just need to trust yourself." Over the next month, they implemented the transition gradually. Elena came 4 days a week, then 3. Richard took over the morning routines, making breakfast with the girls, talking about what small wonders they might explore that day. It was awkward at first. He wasn't as natural as Elena, didn't have her instinctive sense of what would capture the girls' attention. But he tried, and the girls responded, not because he was perfect, but because he was their father and he was showing up. really showing up. Not as a distant provider. Not as someone trying to fix them, but as a participant in their lives. Someone willing to kneel on the floor and watch ice melt. Someone willing to spend an hour examining the pattern on a butterfly wing. Someone willing to be present. One morning, about 7 months after Elena had started, Richard was making breakfast when Sophie came downstairs early. She climbed onto a stool at the kitchen island and watched him work. "Dad." "Yeah, sweetheart. Are you happy?" Richard paused, considering the question. Was he happy? Not in the way he'd been when Margaret was alive. That kind of uncomplicated joy felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. But was he okay? Was he finding moments of peace and contentment? "I'm getting there," he said honestly. "Some days are harder than others. But yeah, I think I'm finding my way back to happy." Sophie nodded. "Me too. I still miss Mom every day. Like, every single day I think about her and wish she was here." "Me too, baby. But I also like looking at cool stuff with Elena. And with you. And I think maybe it's okay to miss Mom and also like other things. Like both can be true at the same time." Richard felt his throat tighten. His 9-year-old daughter had just articulated what it had taken him months to understand. "You're right. Both can be true. You can miss Mom and still enjoy life. That's not being disloyal to her. That's living the way she'd want you to live." Sophie smiled. "That's what Elena says too." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep. "What are we talking about?" "How it's okay to be sad and happy at the same time," Sophie said. Eleanor climbed onto a stool. "Yeah, like yesterday when we saw that monarch butterfly. I thought about how Mom loved butterflies, and I was sad she couldn't see it. But I was also happy we saw it because it was so pretty." "Exactly," Richard said. "That's exactly it." They ate breakfast together, talking about what they might explore that day. The girls had become genuinely interested in natural phenomena. Eleanor had started keeping a detailed sketchbook of everything they observed. Sophie had begun reading science books, trying to understand the principles behind the wonders they witnessed. They were becoming curious, engaged people again. Not despite their grief, but alongside it. After breakfast, as the girls went upstairs to get ready for their day, Richard stood at the kitchen window, looking at Margaret's garden, now in full bloom. Noticing how the morning light made the dew on the rose petals sparkle. How a bee moved from flower to flower with patient determination. How life continued its beautiful, inexorable march forward. He thought about Elena's gift. Not just what she'd taught his daughters, but what she'd taught him. That control was an illusion. That the most powerful thing you could do sometimes was simply notice. That presence mattered more than solutions. That the world was full of wonders if you paid attention. That grief and joy could coexist. Richard pulled out his phone and took a picture of the roses. Then he sent it to Elena with a simple message. "Thank you for teaching us how to see." Her response came a few minutes later. "You were always capable of seeing. You just needed permission to look." 8 months after Elena started, Richard received an invitation that surprised him. A grief support organization wanted him to speak at their annual conference. Someone on the board had heard about his family's story, about the unorthodox approach that had helped his daughters heal. They wanted him to share it with other parents struggling with similar losses. Richard's first instinct was to decline. He wasn't a public speaker about personal matters. He gave keynotes about business strategy and real estate markets, not about his dead wife and traumatized children. But Eleanor convinced him, "Dad, if our story can help even one family, Mom would want you to share it." So Richard agreed. He spent weeks preparing, working with Elena to understand her methodology well enough to explain it to others. "It's not really a methodology," Elena protested. "It's just paying attention." "But why does paying attention work?" Richard pressed. "What's the psychological mechanism?" Elena thought about it. "I think it's because grief makes everything about the loss, about what's missing, about the empty space where someone used to be. And that's important. You need to feel that. But if that's all you feel, you get trapped." She leaned forward. Noticing the world around you reminds you that there's more than just the loss. There's still life happening, still beauty being created, still wonders unfolding. And somehow, recognizing that gives you permission to keep living too. Richard wrote that down. The conference was in Chicago on a Saturday in November. Richard flew out Friday night, nervous in a way he hadn't been for a business presentation in years. This felt more vulnerable, more exposed. He wasn't talking about abstract business concepts. He was talking about the worst period of his life. Saturday morning, standing backstage while someone introduced him, Richard almost backed out. But then he thought about his daughters, about how far they'd come, about Eleanor's smile when she discovered a new technique for drawing water droplets, about Sophie's excitement when she successfully predicted what would happen in a science experiment, about the sound of their laughter, once thought lost forever. He walked onto the stage. The audience was larger than he'd expected. Hundreds of people, all of them carrying their own unbearable losses, all of them looking for hope. Richard began. 9 months ago, I thought I'd lost my daughters, not to death, but to grief. They'd become hollow versions of themselves after my wife died. And despite spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best therapists and specialists money could buy, nothing helped. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I'm a billionaire. I'm used to solving problems with resources, with strategy, with money. But grief doesn't care about your bank account. And traumatized children can't be fixed like a broken machine. Richard told them about Elena, about her simple approach, about water drops and spider webs and the small wonders that had reached his daughters when nothing else could. He explained her philosophy, that grief needed to be felt, but it didn't need to be everything. That redirecting attention to the external world wasn't avoiding grief. It was making space for life alongside grief. He talked about his own transformation, how learning to notice small wonders had changed not just his relationship with his daughters, but his relationship with himself, with his work, with the world. I used to think being present meant being focused on the person in front of you, Richard said. But Elena taught me that sometimes being present means focusing on something else together. On a butterfly, on a raindrop, on anything that reminds you the world is bigger than your pain. His voice grew quieter. My daughters still miss their mother every day. So do I. That hasn't changed. What changed is that grief isn't the only thing we feel anymore. We can be sad and curious. We can miss her and still marvel at a sunset. We can grieve and live at the same time. Richard looked directly at the audience. And if we can do it, you can too. Your children can too. It won't happen overnight. It won't be linear. But it's possible. He shared specific examples. The morning with the water drops. The afternoon in the garden. The small daily rituals of noticing and wondering. You don't need money for this, Richard emphasized. You don't need credentials or training. You just need patience, consistency, and the willingness to pay attention to the world your children live in. He finished with the question Elena had asked him that first day. What would your lost loved one want for your children right now? Not what do you want? Not what seems therapeutic or correct. What would they want? Richard's voice broke slightly. My wife would have wanted our daughters to feel safe enough to grieve, but also safe enough to live, to find joy without guilt, to engage with the world without betraying her memory. And once I understood that, everything changed. The applause was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it, because in the front row sat Eleanor and Sophie, tears streaming down their faces, smiling at him with pride. And beside them, Elena, the woman who taught them all that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone who's drowning isn't to pull them out of the water. It's to swim beside them until they remember they know how to float. After the speech, dozens of people approached Richard. They thanked him for his honesty. They shared their own stories of loss and survival. They asked how to find someone like Elena for their own families. And Richard realized something profound. Elena wasn't unique because of special training or extraordinary skills. She was unique because she understood something most people don't. That broken people don't need to be fixed. They need to be witnessed. They need someone to sit with them in the darkness and say, I see you. I'm here. And I'm not leaving. That's what Elena had done. And that's what had made all the difference. One man, whose teenage son had stopped speaking after his mother's suicide, gripped Richard's hand tightly. I've been pushing him to talk, to process, to engage with therapists, but maybe I should just show him something beautiful instead. Don't stop the therapy, Richard cautioned. But yes, add the beauty, add the wonder. Give him reasons to look outside himself. A woman whose young daughter had lost her father in a car accident asked, but what if she doesn't respond? What if showing her butterflies and rainbows feels trivial compared to her pain? Richard thought about those first weeks with Elena, when nothing seemed to be happening, when the girls stayed locked in their grief. Give it time, and don't present it as, here's something to make you feel better. Present it as, here's something interesting that exists in the world. No agenda, no pressure. Just look at this with me. The conversations continued for over an hour. By the time Richard made it back to his hotel room, he was emotionally exhausted, but also strangely energized. Sharing his family's story had been painful, but it had also been meaningful. If even one family found hope in what Elena had taught them, it was worth the vulnerability. He called home. Eleanor answered, her voice bright. How did it go, Dad? Good. Hard, but good. How are you guys? We're great. Elena took us to this pond and we saw tadpoles. Did you know they breathe through their skin before they develop lungs? It's so cool. Richard smiled. That is cool. Save some for me to see when I get back tomorrow. We will. Dad. Yeah. I'm proud of you. For talking about Mom and us and everything. That was brave. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. Thanks, sweetheart. That means a lot. After they hung up, Richard sat on the hotel bed, looking at the city lights through his window, thinking about how far they'd all come. 9 months ago, he'd stood in a doorway, frozen, listening to his daughter's laugh for the first time in months, terrified it would disappear. Now laughter was normal again, not constant, not uninterrupted by grief, but present, real, part of their daily lives. Elena had done that, with water drops and patience and a deep understanding that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry loss while still embracing life. When Richard returned home the next day, he found the girls in the garden with Elena. They'd set up a small aquarium with pond water and were observing the tadpoles they'd collected. Dad, Sophie called. Come see. Some of them are already growing legs. Richard joined them, kneeling on the grass, looking into the aquarium at the tiny creatures in mid-transformation. They're becoming something new, Eleanor observed. But they're still the same tadpoles. Just different. Elena met Richard's eyes over the girls' heads. She understood the metaphor too. That's what all of them were doing. Becoming something new while still being themselves. Transformed by grief but not destroyed by it. Different, but still here, still alive, still capable of wonder. That evening, after Elena left and the girls were in bed, Richard made a decision. He was going to establish a foundation in Margaret's name, dedicated to helping families navigate grief through unconventional approaches. Not replacing traditional therapy, but supplementing it with the kind of wonder-based engagement Elena had pioneered. He'd fund training programs for caregivers, create resources for parents, support research into alternative grief interventions, and he'd make it accessible to families regardless of income, because what Elena had taught them shouldn't be limited to people who could afford private help. Every family deserving healing deserved these tools. He called his lawyer the next morning and started the process. The Margaret Caldwell Foundation for Childhood Grief and Resilience. When he told Elena about it, she was overwhelmed. Richard, I'm not anyone special. I don't have credentials or methods to teach. You have wisdom, Richard said. You have an approach that works, and you have the ability to train others in that approach. Will you help me build this? Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. For Margaret, and for all the other families out there who need hope. Over the next 6 months, they built the foundation from the ground up. Elena developed a training curriculum based on her principles: presence over intervention, wonder over analysis, external focus alongside internal processing, patience over quick fixes. They hired therapists and educators who understood that grief couldn't be rushed or controlled, who were willing to learn Elena's unconventional approaches, who believed in the healing power of small wonders. They partnered with existing grief support organizations, created free resources for families, funded support groups in underserved communities. The foundation launched 1 year after Margaret's death. Richard gave the keynote at the launch event, speaking about his wife's legacy. Margaret loved small things. She'd stop on walks to examine flowers. She'd spend 20 minutes watching birds at the feeder. She found wonder in everyday moments that most people ignored. His voice was steady now. This foundation honors that part of her. The part that knew life was precious and beautiful and worth paying attention to, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Eleanor and Sophie were there, now 10 years old, strong, resilient, still carrying grief but no longer crushed by it. They'd contributed to the foundation too. Eleanor had created illustrations for the family resources. Sophie had written about her experience for the website. Both girls wanted other children to know that healing was possible, that you could miss someone forever and still have a good life, that grief and joy weren't enemies but companions. The foundation helped hundreds of families in its first year, thousands in the years that followed. And every family learned what Richard's family had learned, that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't a pill or a therapy session. It's a water drop on your fingertip, a butterfly landing on your hand, a moment of pure wonder that reminds you the world is still spinning, still beautiful, still worth engaging with, even after you've lost everything. 2 years after Margaret's death, Richard stood in the same doorway where he'd first heard his daughter's laugh. But everything was different now. The playroom was full of life. Eleanor and Sophie were working on a project for the foundation, creating a video to teach other kids about finding wonder in everyday things. They were animated, engaged, directing each other with the casual confidence of children who'd rediscovered their voices. Elena was there too, but in the background, offering occasional suggestions but mostly letting the girls lead. Her role had shifted, just as she'd predicted. She was no longer the central figure in the girls' healing. She was a supportive presence, a guide when needed, but the girls had internalized her lessons. They didn't need her constant intervention anymore. Richard watched for a moment, then walked into the room. "How's it going?" "Great," Sophie said. "We're showing how to make a rainbow with just a CD and sunlight. It's so simple but so cool." Eleanor added, "We want kids to know they don't need fancy stuff, just curiosity and attention." Richard felt pride swell in his chest. These were his daughters, thriving despite, or perhaps because of, everything they'd been through. That evening, the whole family had dinner together. Richard, Eleanor, Sophie, and Elena. It had become a weekly tradition. Not employer and employee, but family, chosen family, built through shared trauma and healing. Over pasta and salad, they talked about the foundation's latest projects, about the families being helped, about the training programs expanding to new cities, about the research being funded into alternative grief interventions. "Mom would be proud," Eleanor said quietly. Everyone paused. Margaret's name no longer brought immediate tears, just a gentle sadness mixed with love. "She would," Richard agreed. "She'd love that we're helping people, that we turned our pain into something useful." Sophie added, "And she'd love that we're teaching people to notice stuff. She was always doing that, pointing out cool things." They shared memories of Margaret for a while, the good memories now easily accessible, not buried under layers of grief too painful to touch. After dinner, Richard walked Elena to her car. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for saving my family." Elena shook her head. "I didn't save anyone. You all saved yourselves. I just held space while you figured out how." "You taught us how to see," Richard insisted. "How to find beauty in grief." how to live alongside loss instead of being consumed by it. Elena smiled. Margaret taught you that. I just reminded you. After she drove away, Richard stood in the driveway for a moment, looking up at the stars, noticing how they twinkled, how the night air smelled like the roses still blooming in the garden, how even in darkness, there was beauty. He thought about that day 2 years ago, when he'd stood frozen in a doorway, listening to laughter he thought was gone forever. That moment had been a turning point, but not because it fixed everything instantly, because it showed him that healing was possible, that his daughters weren't permanently broken, that life could hold joy again. Everything that came after, the slow rebuilding, the daily practices of noticing and wondering, the gradual return to engagement with the world, had stemmed from that moment. From Elena's simple wisdom, from water drops and patience, from the understanding that sometimes people don't need to be fixed. They need to be witnessed. 3 years later, Eleanor was 13. She'd started high school and joined the art club. Her work was remarkable. Detailed observations of natural phenomena rendered in careful pencil and watercolor. She wanted to be a scientific illustrator, to combine art and science in the way Elena had combined wonder and healing. Sophie was equally thriving. She'd become the president of the junior science club, was already planning to study biology in college, wanted to understand the mechanisms behind the wonders she'd learned to observe. Both girls still had moments of grief, especially around milestones Margaret was missing, birthdays, school events, random moments when they wanted to share something with their mother. But they'd learned to hold those moments without being destroyed by them, to feel the sadness and move through it, to remember Margaret with love instead of only pain. Richard had changed too. He'd stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company, appointed a CEO to handle the business while he focused on the foundation. His priorities had shifted fundamentally. Money and deals and empire building no longer drove him. Purpose did. Making a difference did. Honoring Margaret's memory by helping other families survive what his family had survived. He'd also started dating again, tentatively. A woman named Jennifer who'd lost her husband to cancer, who understood grief's long shadow, who knew that loving someone new didn't erase someone old. The girls liked her, not as a replacement for Margaret, no one could ever be that, but as her own person, someone who made their father smile again, someone who treated them with respect and genuine interest. Elena had become the foundation's executive director, training hundreds of caregivers in her approach, speaking at conferences, writing articles about the intersection of wonder and healing. She'd remarried too, a kind man named David who supported her work and loved her gentle wisdom. The families stayed close. Regular dinners, holidays together, a chosen family built from tragedy but sustained by love. For years after Margaret's death, Richard gave another speech, this time at a much larger conference. International grief specialists and researchers, people who'd initially been skeptical of Elena's approach. Wonder-based intervention, they'd called it dismissively. Too simple, too unscientific. But the data was undeniable. Families using Elena's methods showed significantly better outcomes than traditional therapy alone. Not instead of therapy, but in addition to it. The combination of internal processing and external engagement created a powerful synergy. Richard presented the research alongside Elena, showing case studies, sharing testimonials from dozens of families, explaining the theoretical framework they'd developed. The audience was riveted. Questions poured in, requests for training materials, invitations to expand to other countries. At the end, an older therapist approached them. She'd been practicing for 40 years. "I've been doing this wrong," she said, tears in her eyes. "I've been so focused on helping people process their grief that I forgot to help them remember how to live. Thank you for this gift." Richard and Elena exchanged glances. That was the mission. Not to replace grief counseling, but to remind people that healing meant re-engaging with life. That noticing beauty didn't mean forgetting pain. That wonder and grief could coexist. 5 years after Margaret's death, Richard took the girls to Margaret's grave. They did this annually now. On the anniversary. To remember. To honor. To acknowledge the woman who'd given them life. They brought flowers, roses from the garden that still bloomed every year. Eleanor had brought a new sketchbook filled with her latest drawings. "Look what I made, Mom," she said to the headstone. "You always said I had talent. I think you were right." Sophie shared news about her science fair project. About the butterfly sanctuary she was helping to create at school. About how she was teaching younger kids to observe nature the way Elena had taught her. Richard stood back, letting the girls have their moment. Then he stepped forward. "Hey, Margaret, the girls are amazing. You'd be so proud. They're strong and curious and kind. Everything you wanted them to be." His voice was steady now. "I miss you every day, but I'm okay. We're all okay. Elena taught us how to keep living while still honoring you. How to find joy without guilt. How to notice the beauty you loved so much." He paused. "I hope wherever you are, you can see what we've built. The foundation has helped over 5,000 families now. 5,000 families who learned that grief doesn't have to be the end. That there's still wonder in the world if you look for it." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Sophie placed her hand on the headstone. "We love you, Mom. Always." "Always," Eleanor echoed. As they walked back to the car, Sophie asked a question. "Dad, do you think Mom knows? Like really knows what we're doing?" Richard considered this. "I don't know if there's an afterlife, but I know your mother lives on in you. In the way Eleanor sees beauty everywhere. In the way you're always curious about how things work. In the way both of you care about helping others." He put his arms around both girls. "So yeah, I think she knows. Because she's part of you. And you're carrying her forward with every kind thing you do. Every wonder you notice. Every person you help." Eleanor nodded. "I like that. That she's not gone. She's just different. Changed into something new but still here. Like the tadpoles becoming frogs," Richard thought. Transformed but continuous. That had been Elena's greatest gift. Not teaching them to get over their grief, but teaching them to transform it. To let it shape them without breaking them. To carry Margaret forward while still moving forward themselves. That evening, Richard sat in his study, looking at a photo of Margaret on his desk. She was laughing in the picture. Young, healthy, alive. He smiled at it. Not with the crushing pain of early grief, but with the gentle sadness of acceptance. "We did it," he whispered to the photo. "The girls are okay. Better than okay. They're thriving. And it's because of you, the love you gave them, the example you set, the values you taught." He touched the frame gently. "And it's because of Elena, this woman who walked into our broken lives and showed us how to see again. How to notice. How to find wonder even in pain." Richard thought about that moment in the doorway. The first laugh. The first sign that healing was possible. It seemed like a lifetime ago. And also like yesterday. "Thank you," he said to Margaret's photo. "For the years we had. For these incredible daughters. For teaching me that life is about the small moments, not the big achievements." He paused. "And thank you for sending us Elena. I don't know if you had anything to do with that, but it feels like you did. Like one last gift before you left." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden, at the roses blooming in the moonlight, at the world Margaret had loved so much. A world that kept spinning, kept growing, kept creating beauty even after loss. And he understood finally, completely what Elena had been teaching them all along. That life was bigger than any one person's grief. That the world kept offering wonders if you paid attention. That healing didn't mean forgetting or moving on. It meant expanding, making room for loss and love, grief and joy, sadness and wonder, all of it together, all of it true, all of it part of being human. So what did Elena do that saved Richard Caldwell's family? She showed them water drops. That's it. That's the simple, profound answer. She taught them to notice small wonders, to pay attention to the world around them, to find beauty in ordinary moments, not as a distraction from grief, but as a reminder that grief wasn't everything, that life continued, that there was still reason to be curious, engaged, present. She didn't have a psychology degree, didn't use any complicated therapeutic techniques, didn't rely on medication or intensive interventions. She just showed up every day with patience and presence. And she taught a billionaire and his daughter something money can't buy: how to see, how to wonder, how to live alongside loss instead of being consumed by it. And that's something any of us can do. You don't need wealth or credentials. You don't need special training or expertise. You just need to pay attention, to notice the way light hits a leaf, the pattern of frost on a window, the transformation of a caterpillar, the simple physics of a water drop. And you need to share those noticings with the people you love, especially the people who are hurting, not to fix them, not to make their pain go away, but to remind them that the world is still here, still beautiful, still full of wonders, still worth engaging with, even after loss, especially after loss. Because grief can make everything small and internal, can trap you in a loop of pain with no exit. But wonder makes things big again. External. Reminds you that you're part of something larger than your own suffering. That's what Elena understood. And that's what she taught Richard's family. Not to forget Margaret, but to honor her by continuing to engage with the world she loved. To see beauty the way she saw it. To find joy without guilt. To live fully because she couldn't. So here's the question for you. Who in your life needs to be reminded how to see? Who's trapped in grief or pain or trauma and needs someone to show them a water drop? Maybe it's your child, your partner, your friend, your parent, yourself. Whoever it is, you have the power to help. Not by fixing them, not by having all the answers, but by noticing wonder and inviting them to notice it with you. By being patient, by showing up consistently, by making space for grief and joy to coexist, by teaching them, through your own attention and curiosity, that life is still happening, still beautiful, still worth experiencing. That's Elena's legacy, not just in Richard's family, not just in the thousands of families helped by the foundation, but in everyone who hears the story and understands its simple, powerful truth. Healing doesn't come from control, it comes from presence, from patience, from permission to feel everything. Grief and wonder, pain and beauty, loss and life, all at once. And sometimes the most profound interventions are the simplest ones. A glass of water, a curious mind, a willingness to see. Richard Caldwell was a billionaire who thought he could buy anything. But he learned that the most valuable things in life can't be purchased. They can only be noticed, appreciated, shared. His daughters Eleanor and Sophie were 9 years old when they lost their mother. When grief threatened to swallow them whole, when every expert failed to reach them, but a simple maid with no credentials showed them water drops, and taught them that the world was still full of magic, that life was still worth living, that wonder could coexist with sorrow, and that gift, that simple, profound gift, saved them, not by erasing their pain, but by showing them they could carry it, that they were strong enough, that life was bigger than their grief. That Margaret's love lived on in every butterfly they noticed, every rainbow they created, every moment of curiosity they experienced. That's the truth this story offers. Not that grief goes away, but that it doesn't have to be everything. That healing is possible. That wonder is medicine. That attention is love. And that sometimes all it takes is someone willing to show you how to see. One water drop at a time. If the story touched you, if it changed how you think about grief and healing, we need you to do 3 things. First, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Second, share this video with someone who needs it. Tag them in the comments, send them the link, or sit down and watch it with them. Someone in your life is trapped in grief right now, and this story might be exactly what they need to hear. And third, go outside today and find one small wonder. A shadow on the wall, a leaf with an interesting pattern, a drop of water catching, the light. Really look at it for 30 seconds. Feel what it's like to notice something beautiful while carrying whatever pain you're carrying. Because that's the lesson. That's the gift Elena gave Richard's family. The permission to see beauty without abandoning grief. To live while still honoring loss. Drop a comment below and tell us what wonder you noticed today. Share it with this community. Because when we practice noticing together, when we share the small moments of beauty we find, we create a web of healing that extends far beyond our individual pain. We remind each other that the world is still here, still turning, still offering gifts if we're willing to receive them. Asterisk asterisk. The screen fades to black, but the message remains, etched in the hearts of everyone who heard it. Simple, powerful, true. You don't need money to heal. You don't need degrees or credentials. You just need to notice, to be present, to see the world the way a grieving child needs to see it. Full of wonder, full of possibility, full of reasons to keep going. Elena Morales understood this, and she taught it to a family that had forgotten. Richard Caldwell stood in a doorway 2 years ago, frozen by the sound of his daughter's laughter, terrified it would disappear. But it didn't disappear. It grew, spread, became normal again, because one woman had the wisdom to show 2 broken children a water drop. And in that simple act, she reminded them of something essential. That the world was still beautiful. That curiosity was still possible. That life, even after devastating loss, was still worth living. Not because the pain went away, but because joy could exist alongside it. Wonder could flourish in the same heart that held grief. Love could continue even after death. That's the miracle. Not that healing erases loss, but that it makes room for both. For the full spectrum of human experience. The sadness and the beauty, the grief and the wonder, the endings and the new beginnings. All of it together, all of it true, all of it part of what it means to be human. To love deeply enough that loss breaks you. And to heal courageously enough that you let the world put you back together. Not the same as before, never the same, but whole nonetheless, different, transformed, but alive, and capable of seeing water drops with wonder, capable of noticing roses in the moonlight, capable of teaching other children how to look for beauty, capable of building foundations that help thousands, capable of turning private pain into public purpose. That's what Richard and Eleanor and Sophie did. With Elena's guidance. With Margaret's memory as their compass. With water drops as their teacher. They transformed their grief into something that mattered. Something that helped others. Something that honored the woman they'd lost by continuing the work she'd started. Teaching people to see beauty. To notice small things. To find wonder in ordinary moments. To live fully even when life has broken your heart. And now their story is your story. Their lesson is your lesson. Their gift is available to you. Right now. Today. In this moment. You can choose to notice. To see. To find one small wonder in a world that often feels overwhelmingly painful. You can choose to teach someone else, a child, a friend, a stranger, how to see that wonder too. You can choose to be for someone else what Elena was for Richard's family. A witness. Presence. A patient guide who doesn't try to fix or force, who just shows up and says, "Look at this with me. Isn't it amazing?" That's the revolution. Not dramatic interventions or expensive treatments, but simple noticing, consistent presence, patient attention to the small wonders that surround us always. The ones we walk past every day. The ones we ignore because we're too busy or too sad or too overwhelmed. The water drops, the spider webs, the way light bends through glass, the transformation of a caterpillar, the persistent growth of a rose, all of it teaching the same lesson, that life continues, that beauty persists, that wonder is always available if we're willing to see it. Even in grief, especially in grief, because grief means we loved deeply, and love that deep deserves to be honored, not by stopping, not by shutting down, not by refusing joy, but by living with full hearts that hold everything. The loss and the love, the sorrow and the wonder, the past and the present, the memory of who we've lost and the reality of who we still are. All of it together, all of it sacred, All of it part of the beautiful, terrible, miraculous experience of being human. That's what Elena taught. That's what Richard learned. That's what Eleanor and Sophie embody now as they teach other children. And that's what this story offers you. Not a cure for grief, but a companion for it. Not an escape from pain, but a way to carry it. Not forgetting, but expanding. Making room for everything you feel. All of it, at once. Without apology. Without shame. With the full knowledge that broken hearts can still notice beauty. That grieving souls can still find wonder. That loss and life aren't opposites. They're partners. Dancing together in every moment. Teaching us how to be fully human. Fully alive. Even when everything hurts. Especially when everything hurts. So go. Notice something. Share it with someone. Be the Elena in someone's story. Teach a child to see water drops. Remind a friend that stars still shine. Show yourself that beauty still exists even when your heart is broken. And know that in doing so, you're not betraying your grief. You're honoring it. By refusing to let loss steal everything. By insisting that wonder has a place at the table alongside sorrow. By living the way the people we've lost would want us to live. Fully. Courageously. With eyes open to the magic that's always been there. Waiting for us to notice. Waiting for us to see. Waiting for us to remember that even after losing everything, we haven't lost the capacity to be amazed. That's still ours. Always. Forever. One water drop at a time. Thank you for watching this story. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about healing and hope and the simple wisdom that can save a life. Subscribe, share, and go find your water drop. The world is waiting to show you its wonders. All you have to do is look.